In today's video, you're going to learn the difference between asynchronous and synchronous JavaScript. I know when I first started out, I would hear that JavaScript is a single-threaded synchronous language. But then I'd hear all this stuff about asynchronous JavaScript, and it wasn't super clear to me when I was kind of starting out. So this video is to kind of help you understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous programming. So let's first talk about synchronous programming. And by default, this is how JavaScript is. But the key is by default, meaning this is the regular behavior JavaScript, but it can perform asynchronous tasks. So first off, synchronous JavaScript, it's going to execute your code line by line synchronously from the top of the file to the bottom of the file. And since JavaScript is single-threaded and can only do one thing at a time, it is only going to hit one line, execute it, go to the next line, execute it, next line, execute it. It's going to go synchronously, one line after the other, all the way from the top of your file to the bottom of your file, and execute your code. And this is true whether your code hits a loop or kind of anything like that, a certain condition, it's still going to execute that code synchronously throughout your program. So here on line 24, I have a loop that is basically going to run 10 different times. And JavaScript is not going to move on to line 27 here before it completes this entire loop here. Because of its kind of synchronous default behavior, it's going to move line by line throughout this code and execute it line by line. So it's going to execute line 16, it's going to move to line 17, nothing there, it's going to execute line 18, so on and so forth. So if I run my code here, you're going to see that first, we're going to console log line 10, then line 12, then line 14, then we're going to run this entire loop here, and then we're going to get to line 28. So if I run this here, you're going to see that's exactly what I get. I get line 10, line 12, line 14, and then for every iteration of my for loop, I log out what my iterable is, so 0 through 9 throughout that for loop, and then finally I hit line 22. So this is an example of JavaScript's synchronous default behavior, just going line by line, one line after another, and executing your file from the top line to the bottom line. Now, JavaScript also supports asynchronous behavior, meaning it doesn't necessarily need to execute your code one line after another from the top of your file to the bottom of the file. It has the ability to run code asynchronously. And some different examples of this, which I will cover in future videos, are using promises within JavaScript, using the fetch API from the web browser, using set timeout, and different things like that. All of these are going to add asynchronicity to your code, and it's going to allow JavaScript to kind of get out of its default behavior. And we'll also have videos on the event loop and how all of this works in future videos, but this is just for an understanding of async versus sync JavaScript. And to just show you an example of this, on line 37, I'm just going to console log line 37, and then set timeout is an asynchronous function within JavaScript. It allows you to run some code at some later date. So since you aren't necessarily running the code within a set timeout, right at that moment, it's asynchronous. You kind of set this code up to run, and then it runs at a later point in time. It doesn't run immediately. So you set this code to run, and then it runs later. So it's asynchronous. So in this set timeout call, what we're going to do is we're going to console log timeout running after 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. And then here on line 43, we console log line 43. So what's going to happen here is JavaScript's going to hit line 37. Since console.log is a synchronous function, it is a space synchronous function, not an asynchronous function. It is synchronous. We're going to log out line 37. Then we're going to hit this set timeout function, and I'll go into this in future videos, but all you have to know right now is this is an asynchronous function. So it's asynchronous, and whatever function we pass into set timeout, that is going to run after the specified milliseconds right here. So this console.log is going to run after 1,000 milliseconds. So as we go line by line throughout my code, we are going to console log line 37. we're going to hit this set timeout here, but we are not going to run this yet. We are not going to run this synchronously. Then we're going to go down here. We're going to hit line 43 and we're going to console log line 43. And then after 1 second has passed, we're going to come back and run console.log timeout running. Now, one tricky thing about set timeout is I could actually put 0 milliseconds here and it would still run after all of our synchronous code has completed running, but that will be a little bit of a teaser for our set timeout videos and other videos on asynchronous JavaScript in the future. But as you'll see here, when I run this code, I get line 37, line 43, and then timeout running. Because set timeout is asynchronous, so at first we run this, and then we set our timeout to run this code after 1 second here, and then we run this, and then eventually 1 second will pass, and then we will run timeout running. So this allows us to run asynchronous code. All right, now why is asynchronous code useful? Well, JavaScript is a single-threaded language like I mentioned earlier, so it can only do one thing at a time. Well, what if that one thing that you want to do, what if it takes a long time to perform that task? An example of this could be like a network request, or it could be some complex operation that has poor time complexity from an algorithmic standpoint, something that takes a long time. Well, since JavaScript is by default synchronous, you would have to perform this entire task before moving on throughout the rest of your code. So you might have to wait for, say you had a slow network request, you might have to wait a couple of seconds before running the rest of your program. And do you really want your app to like be paused and frozen for the user while that all those network requests are taking place? Probably not. So wouldn't it be better if you could kind of schedule that network request to occur and then kind of wait for that request to complete and then run some code? Yeah, that would totally be useful, because then you kind of free up your single JavaScript thread, and a thread goes line by line throughout your code to run it. You would free up that JavaScript thread to then move on to other code. You can complete that synchronous code, and then you could come back to that scheduled task that you had and run that code. And it's going to improve the performance of your apps dramatically by being able to perform these tasks asynchronously rather than you needing to wait for like a long network request or a complex algorithm to complete before running any other code in your application. So in JavaScript, by default, it is going to run your code synchronously. It is single threaded, so that single thread is going to go line by line from the top of your file to the bottom of your file and run your code one line at a time and execute it synchronously one line after another. However, JavaScript does support asynchronous programming, meaning you can run your code synchronously line by line, but then you can also schedule some code to run at some later point in time. You can schedule it to run asynchronously, and you can do this using promises, fetch, timeout, and different things like that I'll cover in future videos. And this asynchronous programming is useful because you can free up your single thread in JavaScript to perform some other work instead of needing to wait for network requests to come back or complex algorithms and different things like that to finish before running anything else in your program. So coming soon, we will cover the event loop, async await, fetch, set timeout, promises, and a bunch of stuff regarding asynchronous programming. This is dramatically going to increase your skills as a JavaScript developer to understand how asynchronous programming works. So I definitely hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned the difference between asynchronous and synchronous JavaScript. Leave any questions that you have below, and I will see you in that next one.